Chapter 2, Jamie. The smell of simmering meat and potatoes filled her nose as Jamie kicked off her rain-soaked shoes. Her stomach growled, and she headed for the kitchen to grab an apple. She smiled at the crock-pot plugged in near the stove, condensation collecting on the underside of the lid. The last time Mom tried using the crock-pot, they'd lost power and come home to raw pot roast, equal parts disappointing and wasteful. They couldn't afford to lose food. But a month ago, Jamie's father finished installing solar panels on the roof. They'd had consistent power in the house since. Her mother, Maria, was hunched over the desk in the library-turned-home office, too focused to notice that Jamie had walked through the door. Grateful for a few minutes of peace, Jamie snuck past and trudged upstairs to her room. As quickly as the storm had come, it was gone. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting rays through the window and across her twin bed. She peeled off her wet clothing items and hung them over the back of her chair. Next to her desk was a 5-drawer dresser. Worn edges revealed several layers of paint. Clothing threatened to escape, and one of the drawers sat cockeyed. Jamie yanked on it until it opened far enough for her to retrieve clean shorts and an old band t-shirt. Briskly, she put them on. Faded yellow wallpaper lined the hall as she headed to her little brother's room. The door was cracked, and she pushed it open to find Sawyer, all big blue eyes and tousled wavy brown hair, sitting cross-legged on the floor and playing with his wooden train set. As she stepped in, the floorboards creaked beneath Jamie's feet, and Sawyer looked up with a toothy smile. "Jamie!" he exclaimed, scrambling to his feet and wrapping his little arms around her legs. "Hey, buddy, how was school?" Jamie ran her fingers through his hair. He rested his chin on her thigh and looked up. Jamie attended a summer program at the local school a few days a week. "We drew maps," he said in a silly, robotic voice. "All 38 states." She nodded, and he plopped back down on the floor. It never ceased to amaze her how different the world had become in the time between each of their childhoods. She'd been born into a world with 50 states, but when China invaded, the United States needed help from Canada and Mexico to push back. In exchange, the U.S. had given them territory in the Southwest and Northwest, respectively. The original 13 colonies had banded together and sided with China. The rest of the country was stuck trying to rebuild. "Dinner!" her father's low, booming voice called up the stairs. "You coming, Sawyer?" Jamie asked. "Uh-huh," he replied, snapping a piece of track into place. "Almost done." "Don't take too long or Mom will have a fit." She took the stairs 2 at a time and headed to the dining room buffet to set the table with china. It was white with tiny blue flowers along the edge and a gold ribbon in the center. They had found this set at one of the many thrift stores that popped up in the past decade. It was hard to find anything new, so all those china sets gathering dust in cupboards across the country were finally getting put to good use. Sawyer came thumping down the stairs a few minutes later, just as their mother emerged from her office. "I was about ready to come find you," Jamie said, scooping Sawyer into her arms and planting a kiss on his face. He squealed and wriggled against her until she set him down so they could take their places at the table. Her father, Chris, placed the steaming pot roast with potatoes and carrots from their garden on the table. Jamie's mouth instantly watered. This had always been her favorite smell, and it had been way too long. Pouring a glass of water, her father looked across the table and asked, "How are things at the Capitol, Maria?" Mom sighed, scooping food onto her plate. "Mixed. We're making some progress with the electric grid. We're still months away from consistently getting it up and running." She brought her hand absent-mindedly to her forehead and began massaging her temples. "Today we heard a representative from Chicago speak about the new water treaty. Apparently, Chicago's water supply is completely contaminated now. They want to start sourcing from our supplies. Of course, we want to help them, but at what cost?" Suddenly, she seemed to remember where she was, shaking her head slightly and forcing a smile, looking at Sawyer. "Don't worry, we'll figure it out. It's all going to be fine." "Sure," Dad said, passing a bowl of potatoes to Jamie. "Except for the innocent people disappearing, the ridiculous invasion of privacy they're calling a census. Oh, and that little water crisis we're having." Mom dropped her fork and glared at him, but Dad continued, his gaze steadily on his wife. "And last week I heard about a gunfight in Benton Harbor." "Really?" Sawyer gasped, his eyes wide. "With actual guns?" Mom's voice was stony. "That's enough, Chris." "They should be aware of what's happening around them." Dad pointed at Jamie and Sawyer with his fork. Mom crossed her hands on the table and leaned forward. "Everything is going to be fine. Do we have some challenges? Yes, of course, but we're making progress. She emphasized the last 3 words, then balled her fists and added quietly, I'm proud of the work we're doing at the Capitol. Dad made a low grunt of disapproval but didn't respond. The 4 continued eating silently, their meal punctuated only by cutlery clinking against the china. Jamie made a mental note of everything she was hearing. It wasn't unusual for her parents to bicker like this, though lately their arguments had seemed more charged, less predictable. As uncomfortable as it was to listen to them fight, those were the moments she was most likely to get real information about what was happening. They stopped telling her the truth about the water crisis sometime after the war ended. When the new government was formed and Mom was named a senator, her parents suddenly were hush-hush about government decisions. Everyone knew the water was the state's most valuable resource since the grid went down. Jamie had heard her parents arguing when they thought she was asleep. She knew the situation was more severe than the public realized. Her parents would put her off and change the subject whenever she asked questions about the water crisis or rebuilding. When would they stop treating her like a child? She had the right to know what was happening. Reggie stopped by the shop yesterday, Dad said with a mouthful of potatoes. Mom scowled at him, and he swallowed before he continued. He brought that old Harley over to see if I could figure out how to fix it. I can't believe he can still ride that thing with the state of the roads. But I told him I'd do what I could to get it up and running for a few more years. How's Sierra doing? Mom asked without looking up from her plate. Not good. Reggie had to call the doctor in for her last week. He thinks the cancer's back. He shook his head, staring down at the roast. Reggie's wife had been sick on and off for years. There was a time when it looked like she might enter complete remission, but with supply chains broken down, the pharmaceutical companies had abandoned most drug manufacturing. They tried everything from black market meds to homeopathic solutions, but it wasn't looking like their efforts would be enough to save her. Jamie kept chewing, but the potato in her mouth tasted like sawdust. It was so unfair. Sierra used to own the clothing boutique downtown. Jamie used to love going there with her mother. The store was bright and cheery and smelled like lemon verbena. Jamie would pull away from her mother's hand and wander the store, running fingers over the luxurious fabrics. Mom nodded somberly, then sniffed. This weekend we'll have to take a casserole or those brownies she likes so much. Sawyer and I can do it, Jamie said, looking at her brother. Sawyer nodded. It would be good to do something to help, even if it was just a pan of desserts. Sawyer smiled. Can we put sprinkles on the brownies? Of course, buddy, Jamie replied. After dinner, Jamie stood over the soapy sink of dishes. The little radio played Motown hits from a station out of Saginaw. Jamie and Sawyer danced along with the music. Sawyer stood on the old wooden step stool next to her, a threadbare kitchen towel in his hands, ready to dry. Jamie looked over at her little brother, and her heart ached. Justin would have loved Sawyer. Grief was inconvenient, busting through the small happy moments and threatening to steal all the joy. But she had lots of practice at swallowing it down, so she did. Jamie headed to her room after they finished putting away the dishes. Curling up on her bed, she leaned over and grabbed her sketchbook, knocking over a cup and sending colored pencils rolling under her bed. Shoot, she thought as she rolled onto the floor with a thud and started raking them out from under the bed, along with a gross amount of dust bunnies and a few socks. Settling back into her bed, she scratched her pencil in a rough sketch on the paper. Just as she settled into her drawing, a quiet knock sounded at her door. Sawyer poked his head through the opening. Can I cuddle with you for a while? Sure, she said, sliding over the cotton sheets and pulling back the covers. Thank you, he said in his smallest, sleepiest voice. He nuzzled into her side and looked up at her through his heavy eyelids, hands curled under his chin. I'd say you're getting too old for this, but how can I resist it when you're so cute? Jamie slid her arm around him and patted his shoulder. Your bed is better than mine, he mumbled, eyes half closed. Sawyer was afraid of the dark. He had nightmares. They all did. They tried to shield him from the worst, but he picked up on more than he should have. Some realities were too dark and too painful to keep from curious little eyes. Sawyer's breathing became slow and even, and she laid her head back on the pillow. She couldn't stop thinking about what her mother had said at dinner. We want to help them, but at what cost? It sounded eerily familiar to something she'd heard someone say long ago. She squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the covers tighter around her, but couldn't shake the sense of dread.